I just want to read a little bit of this transcript from a presentation that Dr. Grieger from Nutrition Facts, a science-backed public health site, he talked about this pandemics and history and prevention, and it has some very interesting facts about zoonotic diseases in it, which I think you might find interesting. So I was just going to share some of it, probably about 5 or 10 minutes worth. I hope you enjoy it. The two greatest threats facing humanity, according to the United Nations, are climate change and the emerging infectious disease, particularly pandemic influenza. The current focus of pandemic discussions and debate, understandably, centers on what we in the public health community refer to as secondary prevention, mediating the impact of the next pandemic, an intervention analogous to mammography. Mammograms don't prevent cancer, but if caught early enough, for example, we may be able to decrease morbidity and mortality, and the same with pandemic planning. What of primary prevention, the possibility of preventing the emergence of pandemic viruses in the first place? Like cancer, the root cause is likely multifactorial. Difficult to tease out, but a question worth exploring nonetheless, and the question I'd like to address here today. Let's go back a few years ago, 1981. Here in the United States, Ronald Reagan takes the oath, MTV starts broadcasting Indiana Jones, and Pac-Man mania is all the rage. In June, the CDC releases a tiny bulletin. 5 men in Los Angeles, it seems, were dying with a strange cluster of symptoms. From humble beginnings, AIDS has since killed 25 million people. Now, so he goes on to talk about where AIDS, SARS, Ebola, mad cow, and bird flu came from. So he said, let's go back a bit further, much further. Human beings have been on this earth for millions of years, yet throughout most of human evolution, there were no epidemic diseases. No one ever got the measles because measles didn't exist. No one got smallpox. No one got the flu. Not even the common cold until about here, 10,000 years ago. Medical anthropologists have identified 3 major periods of disease since the beginning of human evolution, and the first started just 10,000 years ago with the domestication of animals. When we brought animals into the barnyard, they brought their diseases with them. When we domesticated cows and sheep, for example, we also domesticated their rinderpest virus, which turned into human measles, now thought of as a relatively benign disease. Over the last 150 years, measles has killed 200 million people, and in a sense, all those deaths can ultimately be traced back just a few hundred generations to the taming of the first cattle. Smallpox came from camel pox. We domesticated pigs and got whooping cough. We domesticated chickens and we got typhoid fever and typhoid Mary, and domesticated ducks and got influenza. Before the domestication of ducks, likely no one ever got the flu. Leprosy likely came from water buffalo, and the common cold from horses. How often did wild horses have the opportunity to sneeze into humanity's collective face until they were broken and bridled? Until then, the common cold was presumably only common to them. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Professor Diamond tried to explain why the diseases of the landing Europeans wiped out up to 95% of Native Americans and not the other way around. Why didn't Native Americans' plagues kill the Europeans? Well, because there were no plagues. In his chapter, Lethal Gift of Livestock, he explains how before the Europeans arrived we had buffalo, but no domesticated buffalo, so no measles. American camels were wiped out in the Pleistocene Ice Age, so no smallpox. No pigs, and so no pertussis. No chicken, so no typhoid. So while people were dying by the millions of killer scourges in Europe and Asia, none were dying with diseases in the so-called New World because there weren't essentially foreign animals to domesticate. There wasn't this spillover of animal disease. The next great period of human disease started just a few hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, leading to an epidemic of the so-called diseases of civilization: diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer, etc. But by the mid-20th century, the age of infectious disease at least was thought to be over. We had penicillin, we conquered polio, eradicated smallpox. In fact, in 1968, the US Surgeon General declared the war against infectious diseases had been won. In 1975, the Dean of Yale School of Medicine pronounced that there were no new diseases to be discovered, except maybe lung cancer. But even Nobel laureates were seduced in the heady optimism of the time. One famous virologist wrote in a 1962 textbook, quote, "To write about infectious disease is almost to write about something that's passed into history, the most likely forecast of the future of infectious disease," end quote. He wrote, "is that it will be very dull," end quote. But then something changed. After decades of declining infectious disease mortality in the United States, the trend has reversed in recent decades. This is a graph from the CDC of infectious disease mortality over time. Well, I don't have the graph, sorry. In the last 50 years or so. And as you can see, it starts declining. But then around 1975, it started to go back up. The number of Americans dying from infectious disease started to go back up. Starting around 1975, new diseases started to emerge and re-emerge at a rate unheard of in the annals of medicine. More than 30 new diseases in 30 years, mostly newly discovered viruses. In fact, the whole concept of emerging infectious disease has gone from a mere curiosity in the field of medicine. Now it's an entire discipline, really moved to center stage. We may soon be facing, according to the US Institute of Medicine, what they call a catastrophic storm of microbial threats. We are now smack dab in the third era of human disease, which seems to only have started about 30 years ago. Medical historians have called this time in which we live the age of emerging plagues, almost all of which come from animals. But we domesticated animals 10,000 years ago. What has changed in recent decades to bring us to this current situation? Well, we are changing the way animals live. Take Connecticut, for example, where in 1975, Lyme disease was first recognized. Since spread across all 50 states, affecting an estimated 100,000 Americans since its emergence. Lyme disease is caused by bacteria-infested deer ticks, but the primary host is actually not deer, but the white-footed mouse. These ticks themselves, not quite as cute really, but we've been sharing the woods with these fellows forever. What changed recently was suburbia. The black-legged ticks lived on the white-footed mouse, kept at bay by woodland predators. But then developers came in and chopped up American woodlands into subdivisions, scaring away the foxes and bobcats, and now we have more mice, more ticks, and more disease. We are changing the way animals live, going back a little farther, with the big cattle-producing nations fighting during the Second World War. What Argentina did took advantage of the situation by dramatically expanding its beef industry at the expense of its rainforest. There we discovered the deadly human virus, or rather it discovered us, and the so-called hamburgerization of the rainforest exposed hemorrhagic fever viruses all across the continent subsequently. Turning to the other side of the world, cutting into Africa's rainforest exposed a number of other hemorrhagic fever viruses, including Lassa virus, Rift Valley fever, and of course Ebola. Now the inroads into Africa's rainforest were logging roads cut by transnational timber corporations, hacking deep into the rainforest, dragging along a hungry migrant workforce which survived on quote-unquote bushmeat, wild animals that were killed for food. Now these include upwards of 26 different species of primates, including a number of endangered great ape species, gorillas, chimpanzees, who are shot, butchered, smoked, and sold as food. Now, by cannibalizing our fellow primates, we may be exposing ourselves to viruses, particularly fine-tuned to our own primate physiology. In fact, recent outbreaks of Ebola, for example, have been traced to the exposure of the bodies of infected great apes, hunted for food. Now Ebola is one of our deadliest infections, but not efficiently spread compared to virus like HIV. The leading theory as to the emergence of the AIDS virus is direct exposure to animal blood and secretions as a result of hunting, butchering, and the consumption of contaminated bushmeat. Experts believe The most likely scenario is that HIV arose from humans soaring their way into the jungle, butchering chimpanzees for their flesh along the way. Now, in many countries in Africa, the prevalence of HIV exceeds 25% of the adult population, leaving millions of orphan children in its wake. Someone butchered a chimp a few decades ago, and now 25 million people are dead. But wildlife has been hunted for thousands of years. Yes, but never before like this. With the demand for wildlife meat outstripping local supplies, what countries have done is set up these intensive captive production farms, cramming wild animals in these cramped, filthy cages, and then smuggling them around the world. This intensive commercial bushmeat trade actually started in the live markets of Asia, particularly the Guangdong province, a southern province surrounding Hong Kong, from which the current bird flu threat arose. The civet cat, a popular commodity in these Chinese animal markets. In addition to being raised for their flesh, they also produce the most expensive coffee in the world. So-called fox dung coffee is produced by feeding coffee beans to captive civets and then, you guessed it, recovering the partially digested beans from their feces. A musk-like substance of buttery consistency, secreted by the anal glands, is said to give this coffee its distinctive flavour. One might say this unique drink is good to the last dropping. I'm sorry, this animal was blamed for the SARS epidemic. Quoting from the medical journal Lancet, quote, a culinary choice in South China led to a fatal infection in Hong Kong, end quote. Subsequently, 8,000 cases of SARS, nearly 1,000 deaths, 30 countries, 6 continents. Maybe they should have stuck to Starbucks. These live animal markets took a class of viruses which in human medicine we have only known for causing the common cold and seemed to turn them into a killer, SARS, which then spread around the world. Viruses can escape rainforests in animals, live or dead, as pets or as meat. Pets in quotes, or as meat. In 2003, the exotic pet trade brought monkeypox from the jungles of West Africa to Wisconsin. Bird smuggling may have actually been what brought West Nile virus to the Western Hemisphere. Here, it hits New York in '99 and since spread across the country. Hundreds of human deaths, hundreds of cases, all perhaps because of a single imported pet bird. So we are changing the way animals live, contributing to the emergence of these new diseases. But you know, there's one way we have changed our relationship with animals that really outshadows all the rest. In response to this torrent of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, the world's 3 leading authorities got together for a joint consultation. The World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the World Organization for Animal Health, the world's leading veterinary authority, got together to uncover the key underlying causes of this age of emerging plagues. They came up with four main risks, 4 main themes of risk factors for the emergence and spread of all of these new diseases. Yes, they talked about the exotic pet trade. They talked about bushmeat, but number 1 on their list was this increasing demand for animal protein the world over. Yes, we domesticated animals 10,000 years ago, but never before like this, especially pigs and poultry. Chickens used to peck around the barnyard, but now chickens raised for meat are typically warehoused in sheds containing tens of thousands of birds. About half of the egg-laying hens on this planet are now confined in what are called battery cages. These small barren wire enclosures extending down long rows and windowless sheds can be up to 1 million birds on a single farm. About half of the pigs on the planet are now again crowded into these intensive confinement operations. You know, old McDonald's farm has since been replaced by the new McDonald's farm. These intensive systems represent the most profound alteration of the human-animal relationship in 10,000 years, and no surprise, there are breeding grounds for disease. A few snapshots. China, 2005, the largest pork-producing nation, suffers an unprecedented outbreak of an emerging pig pathogen, strep suis, causing meningitis and deafness in people handling infected pork products. Hundreds of people infected, the deadliest strain on record. Why? Well, according to the World Health Organization, indeed it seems to be these intensive confinement conditions. The USDA elaborates, quote, all strep suis starts out harmless but as natural gut flora, but then the immunosuppressive effect of stress due to overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, causes the bug to go invasive, causing infections of the brain, blood, heart, lungs, and death. Starts out harmless, turns deadly. That's what these kinds of conditions seem to be able to do. This is not arguably how animals were meant to live. Well, no, they're actually not meant to live with us enslaving them and exploiting them. That's the bottom line. It's not even about them living in confined areas. They just shouldn't be exploited at all. Pig factories in Malaysia birthed the Nipah virus, one of the deadliest of human infections, a contagious respiratory ailment killing 40% of those it infects, causing relapse and brain infections, propelling it onto the official US list of bioterrorism agents. And again, according to one of the leaders of the field, it seems to be the way in which we now raise these animals. So the three eras of human disease can be characterized, perhaps, as first the diseases of domestication, then the diseases of industrialization, and finally of land use and agriculture intensification. We took natural herbivores like cows and sheep, turned them into carnivores and cannibals by feeding them slaughterhouse waste, blood and manure, and then we took downed animals, too sick to even walk, fed them to people, and now we have mad cow disease. We fed antibiotics to farm animals by the truckload. This is the total amount of antimicrobials used for all of human medicine every year. Now contrast that with the amount we feed to farm animals just to promote growth or prevent disease in such a stressful, unhygienic environment. Millions of pounds a year, and now we have these multi-drug resistant bacteria. And we, as physicians, are running out of good antibiotic options. Scientists at NYU trace the path of some of these superbugs, starting, for example, with the mass feeding of the Cipro class of antibiotics to chickens, and then there is a fecal contamination of the carcass at slaughter. We buy chicken at the supermarket polluted with fecal material, leading to longer and more severe human infections. The CDC recently really clinched it. They spent $1 million over a three-year period doing rectal swabs of newly admitted hospital patients. This is what they found. Essentially, they found zero growth of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria within the bodies of those that had zero contact with fresh or frozen poultry. But at least these so-called superbugs aren't effectively transmitted from one person to the other. With the seeming propensity of industrial animal agriculture to churn out these novel lethal human pathogens, what if these animal factories gave rise to a virus capable of a global pandemic of disease? And by the way, this talk by Dr. Grieger was given about, 8 or 9 years ago, possibly longer. Let me put these new animal disease threats in perspective. SARS infected thousands of human beings, killed hundreds. Nipah infected hundreds, killed scores. Strep suis infected scores, killed dozens. Now AIDS has infected millions, but there's only one virus on the planet that can rapidly infect billions, and that's influenza. Influenza, the so-called last great plague of mankind, is the only known pathogen capable of truly global catastrophe these days. Unlike many other important diseases like malaria, which are largely confined at the equator, or a virus like HIV, which is only fluid-borne, the influenza virus is considered the only pathogen capable of literally infecting half of humanity within a matter of months. Now, in the 4,500 years that we as a species have had influenza since the first domestication of birds, influenza has always been one of the most contagious known diseases. But only since the emergence of this highly pathogenic, highly disease-causing strain, H5N1, has the influenza virus also emerged as one of our deadliest, H5N1 spreading out of Asia, 2004, 2005, 2006, and continuing to this day, has only killed about a few hundred people. And not to minimize, Each death is a terrible tragedy, but in a world in which millions of people continue to die of diseases like AIDS, tuberculosis, why is there so much concern about this so-called bird flu? Because it happened before. Because the last time a bird flu virus adapted to human beings, it triggered the worst plague in human history, the influenza pandemic of 1918. Modern flu strains tend to spare young, healthy adults, but the 1918 virus killed people in the prime of life. In 1918, a quarter of all Americans fell ill. This is a chart of, quote, percent of population die, end quote. Humanity's great mass murderer eluded scientists for nearly a century before a mass grave in Alaska was unearthed. Victims of the pandemic froze in the permafrost for 80 years. Traces of virus in her lungs allowed scientists to piece together letter by letter the genetic code of the 1918 virus, solving perhaps the greatest medical detective story of all time. Humanity's greatest killer was bird flu. First civilian casualty in the US was September 11th, ironically, 1918, and then in a single month, this was week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and this is 1918 now. We're talking steam locomotive here. Scientists at the Imperial College of London ran a simulation to see how a pandemic might spread today in the UK. Scientists at Los Alamos ran a simulation through their supercomputers to see how a pandemic might spread in the day of commercial airline travel. Here it hits LA in this simulation, and in a few weeks the entire country is blanketed. In 1918, between 50 and 100 million people lost their lives. A similar virus today could kill many, many more. What started out for millions as muscle aches and a fever ended days or even hours later with many people bleeding from their eyes, from their nostrils, from their ears, into their lungs. Homeless orphans, their parents dead, wandered the empty streets. One agonized official in the stricken East sent an urgent warning west, quote, hunt up your woodworkers and set them making coffins, then take your street laborers and set them to digging graves, end quote. This is a clipping from the New York Times. At the time, victims of plague everywhere, great piles of bodies consumed by the flames, many victims strangled in their own bloody fluids. Their corpses, tinged blue from suffocation, were said to have been stacked like cordwood outside of morgues, and cities ran out of coffins, so they dug mass graves. The bird flu originating virus killed more people in 25 weeks than AIDS has killed in 25 years. No war, no plague, no famine has ever killed so many people in so short a time as the 1918 pandemic. Yet in 1918, the mortality rate of this disease was less than 5%. This estimate here, potentially tens of millions of people dead in the next pandemic, is based on that same 2 to 3% mortality rate. What the CDC is now calling a Category 5 pandemic, around 2% mortality, around 2 million Americans dying. So that's 2%. Currently, H5N1 is officially killing over half of its human victims. Don't even seem to get a coin toss as to whether or not one lives through this disease. Dr. Robert Webster, the world's leading authority on bird flu, quote, if we go back to 1918, 2.5% of people died. How many people are dying with bird flu? 50%? We've never seen such an event since the time of the plagues. Up to 60 million Americans come down with the flu every year. What if it suddenly turned deadly? That's what keeps everyone up at night, the possibility, however slight, that a virus like H5N1 could trigger a human pandemic. That'd be like combining one of the most contagious known diseases, influenza, with one of the deadliest, like crossing a disease like Ebola with the common cold. Where did this virus come from? Well, the current dialogue surrounding avian influenza speaks of a potential H5N1 pandemic as if were a natural disaster, a hurricane, earthquake, of which we could possibly have control. The reality, though, is that the next pandemic may be more of an unnatural disaster of our own making. In poultry, bird flu has gone from exceedingly rare disease to one which now pops up every year. The number of outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza in the first few years of this century have already exceeded the total number of outbreaks recorded for the entire 20th century. The emergence of H5N1 has been blamed on free-ranging flocks and wild birds, but people have been keeping chickens in backyards for thousands of years, and birds have been migrating for millions. Bird flu has been around forever. What turned bird flu into a killer? Well, the senior correspondent of NewsHour with Jim Lehrer posed the question to Dr. Webster, the so-called godfather of flu research. Quote, was there something qualitatively different about this last decade made it possible for this disease to do something it's never done before? Some kind of change in conditions that suddenly lit a match to the tinder, end quote. Webster replied, he said, farming practices have changed. He talks about growing up on a farm, but quote, now we put millions of chickens into a chicken factory next door to a pig factory, and this virus has the opportunity to get into one of the chicken factories and make billions and billions of these mutations continuously. And so what we've changed is the way we raise animals and our intention with those animals, end quote. And then he talks about how the virus is escaping from the factories, infecting wild birds. He says that that's what's changed. We've changed the way we raise animals, but we change the way we raise animals by the billions. The number of chickens we slaughter every day, spread wing to wing, would wrap more than twice around the world's equator. The big shift in the ecology of avian influenza has been the intensification of the global poultry sector. The developing world meat and egg consumption has exploded, leading to these industrial-scale commercial chicken factories, arguably the perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of these so-called, quote, super strains, end quote, of influenza. In the early 1980s, nearly all the chickens in China were raised in tiny backyard outdoor flocks, and now there are 63,000 CAFOs, that's confined operations, in China. Concentrated animal feeding operations, with a few of these so-called factory farms confining 10 million birds on a single farm. The World Health Organization blames emergence of H5N1, SARS, Nipah virus, all these new deadly emerging Asian viruses, in part on what they call the overconsumption of animal products in this intensive animal agriculture. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations starts out, quote, there seems to be an acceleration of human influenza problems in recent years, end quote. This is what they mean. This is from the World Health Organization. These are all the new influenza viruses affecting human beings over the last century or so. Now turn your attention to just 1995 on. Seems to be kind of snowflakes to an avalanche in people too. But why? Well, according to the world's leading agricultural authority, this is expected to largely relate to the intensification of poultry production and possibly pig production as well. They elaborate in an internal FAO document, quote, chicken-to-chicken spread, particularly where assisted by this intensive husbandry conditions, causes the virus to shift, adapt to more severely highly pathogenic type of infection. Intensive production favors the rapid spread of the viruses in the so-called, quote, hotting up, end quote, of the virus from low pathogenicity to highly pathogenic types. Factory farms, it seems, can be thought of as the incubators of the emergence of highly disease-causing strains of this virus. In this diagram here, they actually trace the path of the human pandemic, starting with increased demand for poultry products and ending up with a virus capable of human-to-human transmission. The United Nations, in fact, has called on all governments to fight the role of what they call factory farming. Quoting from UN press release, quote, governments, local authorities, international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of factory farming, which combined with these live bird markets provide ideal conditions for the virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form. All bird flu viruses start out harmless to both birds and people. Very important to understand. They start out harmless. Avian influenza has existed for millions of years as a harmless intestinal virus of aquatic birds like ducks, waterborne virus. I said, well, how does a duck's intestinal bug end up in a human cough? Well, in people, the virus must make us sick in order to spread, must make us cough in order to shoot virus from one person to the next. With the virus' natural reservoir, aquatic birds like ducks The virus doesn't need to make the duck sick in order to spread. In fact, it's in the virus's evolutionary best interest not to make the duck sick, as dead ducks don't fly very far. So the virus silently multiplies, and the intestinal lining of the duck is secreted out into the pond water, is swallowed up by another duck, and the cycle continues, as it has for millions of years, and no one gets hurt. But if an infected duck is dragged to a live bird market, for example, crammed in cages high enough to spot a virus-infected feces on land-based birds, terrestrial birds like chickens, well then, the virus has a problem. If the virus finds itself in the gut of a chicken, it no longer has the luxury of easy waterborne spread. Chickens aren't paddling around in a pond, so the virus must mutate or die. Unfortunately for us, mutating is what influenza viruses seem to do best. So its natural reservoir, it's been described as being in total evolutionary stasis, harmless, but when thrown into a new host like land-based birds, it quickly starts mutating, acquiring mutations to adapt to its new host. In the open air, it must resist dehydration, for example, and it may have to spread to different organs to find a new way to travel. The intestines ain't going to work anymore, and they may find the lungs and become an airborne pathogen, which is bad news for terrestrial mammals, such as ourselves. Goes into chickens as an aquatic virus, but may come out as a flu. In its new host, the more virulent, the more violent the virus becomes. The quicker it may be able to overwhelm the immune system of its new host. But if the virus becomes too deadly, though, it may not spread as far. In an outdoor setting, at least, if the virus kills its host too quickly, the animal may be dead before it has a chance to spread to too many others. So in nature, there's a kind of natural limit on how virulent these viruses can get, or at least there was until now. Enter intensive poultry production, when the next beak is just inches away, there may be no limit to how nasty these viruses can get. Evolutionary biologists believe that this is the key to the emergence of hypervirulent predator-type viruses like H5N1, disease transmission from immobilized hosts. See, when you have a situation where the healthy cannot escape the disease, where the virus can knock you flat and still transmit just because you're so crowded, then there may be no stopping rapidly mutating viruses from becoming truly ferocious. And this may explain the virus of 1918 rising out of the trenches of World War I. There were these crowded troop transports, boxcars were labelled, quote, 8 horses or 40 men, end quote. So when this harmless virus found itself in these conditions, it turned deadly. Millions forced together under cramped quarters, no escaping a sick comrade. This is thought to be where the virus of 1918 gained its influence, its virulence. From the virus point of view, though, these same trench warfare conditions exist today. In every industrial chicken shed, every industrial egg operation, confined, crowded, stressed, but by the billions, not just millions. The industry is slowly waking up to this growing realization that viruses previously innocuous to natural host species have, in all probability, become more virulent by passes through these large commercial populations. This from an industry journal starts out harmless, turns deadly. That's what these conditions may be able to do. This is not arguably how animals were meant to live. So how does the poultry industry feel about the possibility that its own animal factories may produce a virus capable of killing millions of people around the world? Well, the executive editor of, quote, Poultry, end quote, magazine wrote an editorial on just that topic. She wrote, quote, the prospect of a virulent flu to which we have absolutely no resistance is frightening. However, to me, the threat is much greater to the poultry industry. I'm not as worried about the US human population dying from bird flu as I am that there will be no chicken to eat, end quote. Well, that's charming, but not surprising. This is how the Department of Interior puts it, quote, domesticated poultry is the necessity stepping stone to create a pandemic strain of influenza, end quote. Now we used to think pigs were an important link in the chain, so this probably not a good idea. H5N1 found a way, it seems, not only to kill people directly, but seems to have gone full circle, reinfecting its natural hosts, migratory aquatic species, who could potentially fly this factory farm virus to continents around the world. Now, unfortunately for us, there's some quirk of evolution. The respiratory tract of a chicken seems to bear striking resemblance to our own primate respiratory tract on a molecular level, on a virus receptor level. So, as the virus gets better at infecting, killing chickens, the virus may be getting better at infecting and killing us. Virologist Earl Brown, specialist in the evolution of influenza viruses, quote, "You have to say," end quote, Dr. Brown concluded, quote, "Again, this is highly intensity chicken rearing, really the perfect environment for the evolution for generating virulent avian flu virus," end quote. Now, in contrast, there has never been a single recorded emergence of a highly pathogenic flu virus ever from an outdoor chicken flock. Never once has a dangerous, deadly virus ever arisen that we now know of in chickens kept outside. You can breed a deadly virus here. It can escape, in fact, backyard birds, free-ranging flocks, even wild birds, but the transition from harmless to deadly always seems to happen in these kinds of conditions because of the overcrowding. Remember, transition from immobilized hosts because of the sheer numbers. Because of the inadequate ventilation, the dankness helps keep the virus alive. Because of the stress crippling their immune systems. Because of the filth. The virus is in the feces that they're lying in, which decomposing, releasing ammonia, burning their respiratory tracts, predisposing them to respiratory infection in the first place. And because there may be no sunlight, the UV rays and sunlight are actually quite effective in destroying the influenza virus. 30 minutes of direct sunlight completely inactivates H5N1, but it can last for days in the shade and weeks in moist manure. So you can put all these factors together, and what you have is the kind of perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of new superstrains of influenza. But what about biosecurity? Don't we want all the birds confined indoors away from the waterfowl? I mean, does it matter? If these kinds of conditions can turn a harmless virus into a deadly virus, if the harmless virus can't get inside in the first place? Well, an FAO research report addressed this very question. They, in their evidence-based analysis, they looked at the best data set available, a massive survey of flocks in Thailand in which over 1 million birds were tested for H5N1 in factory farms and backyard flocks. And what they expected to find was that the backyard flocks would be a higher risk of infection because they're just out there in the open. What they found was exactly the opposite. They found that backyard flocks are a significantly lower risk of infection compared to commercial scale operations. Industrial quail and chicken operations were at least 4 times more likely to become infected than backyard flocks. So not only may factory farms be the incubators for the original emergence of high path strains based on the best science available, they may also play a role in the subsequent spread of the virus as well, in part because of the massive inputs and outputs required for this industrial style of animal agriculture. Tons of feed and water go in, tons of waste comes out, tons of thousands of flies buzzing around, and these high-volume ventilation fans blowing dust and waste out into the countryside, potentially contaminating the air, the soil, insects, rodents. Transport, industrial-style production can lead to industrial-style contamination of the environment. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health looked back and realized that their conclusions were actually consistent with other high-path outbreaks, whether in the Netherlands, Canada, Italy, other diseases. Factory farms consistently at higher risk. They conclude that there's no empirical evidence to support this myth that backyard flocks are somehow the crux of the problem. And again, people have been raising birds in their backyards for about 4,000 years before the disease erupted out of control. On other factors, the studies have uncovered widespread disregard for biosecurity, even in developed countries, which claim to have the best biosecurity in the world. According to North Carolina University Poultry Health Management, high biosecurity is still wishful thinking in many areas of intensive poultry production. A bird flu outbreak in Virginia in 2002 led to the deaths of 4 million birds. Found its way inside 200 factory farms, highlighting just how wishful the thinking is that industrialized poultry populations are somehow completely protected against this kind of infection. Based on the rapid spread of avian influenza in Virginia recently this decade, USDA poultry virologists conclude the obvious, that biosecurity on many farms is simply inadequate. Investigators from the University of Maryland surveyed chicken facilities throughout the Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia Peninsula, perhaps the most concentrated density of chickens in the world, and concluded that U.S. chicken flocks were constantly at risk for infection triggered by these poor biosecurity practices. But even if the industry had perfect compliance with these guidelines, even if everyone going in and out stepped in antiseptic foot baths, scrubbed their boots, washed their hands, even with perfect compliance, it likely would not be enough. You can watch this whole presentation by Dr. Michael Grieger about pandemics on his site, nutritionfacts.org. And please note, I always have a disclaimer with any external sites that I point to, that I don't necessarily agree with all opinions, etc. on these sites. Any site that I mention, any group, individual, etc. that I mention, I don't necessarily endorse everything that they say or whatever, past or future. But it's a very good site, nutritionfacts.org, and so you can find that presentation there, the whole presentation. I just wanted to read parts of it because I think it's very, very interesting, and it really shows how important it is for us to, well, firstly, we should go vegan for the animals because they're not our resources, they're not our property, they're sentient, and they love life just like we do, and they do not want to die. And the second reason is because animal agriculture is destroying the planet, and it's actually one of the major contributors to the Amazon rainforests being destroyed at 2 acres a minute at this present time with Bolsonaro in office, and that's been going on for a long time now. And also the climate crisis. This recent study by Dr. Joseph Poore in the UK, the largest study to date, 119 countries, 40,000 farms from farm to fork, 90% of all we eat. And the conclusion was that a plant-based diet, a vegan diet free of dairy, eggs, and meat, etc., is one of the biggest things the single most important thing you can do to address the climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction. And lots of other issues too, lots of other problems as well. So anyway, so this is just one of hundreds of reasons that we should consider going vegan, that this is only going to get worse because factory farming is never going to go away, because as population increases, and if it gets to 10 billion by 2050, we won't even be able to feed the population with animal products because it's unsustainable. So that we have to let go or be dragged, basically. We have to let go of this violent and unnecessary practice of animal agriculture and animal product consumption, because it's not only killing us in the amounts that we eat animal products, it's destroying the planet, and most importantly, it's destroying the lives of 1 to 3 trillion land and aquatic sentient animals every single year, for trivial reasons and mostly palate pleasure. Since we do not need animal products at all to survive, we can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. So the only reason we're assisting these pandemics to arise and all these different zoonotic diseases, animal to human diseases, and why we're destroying the planet and contributing majorly to the climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction, all of these things and all that goes with it, with the climate crisis, all of these things is because we think these animal products taste good. As you can see, it's something we must abandon. We must abandon our speciesist view that other animals are here for us to use. They are fellow travelers on this planet. They are fellow sentient beings, and we never had a right to use them. We never had a right to exploit them and kill them. We did it because we could. It was a might make right attitude that we had, and a human supremacist attitude, and an attitude which is one of many attitudes we have towards other human other human groups. All these phases of ignorance, they're just the same ignorance, but applied to different groups. In this case, the most vulnerable group on the planet, animals, other animals. So anyway, that's all I wanted to share this with you. I thought it was a really great parts of this I wanted to share with you by Dr. Michael Grieger, and I hope you found it as interesting as I did. So thanks for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive notifications when I drop a video. Thanks for watching. Till next time, go vegan, and check out my vegan resource in podcast form, howtogovegan.org. Bye for now.